So we're going to be talking about getting creative about race. And this is a topic that, we were talking about it and they were saying, hey, we want to engage. I thought this would be a great, fun thing because of the background that I have in ministry. And so many of you who saw who saw what in the bio, you saw that I was a part of an organization called Threaded. And so Threaded is a biblical racial reconciliation organization that I get to run and lead with a mission to inspire relationships, reconciliation, and collaborative action. So we've been going since about 2014, but my original experience before I got into this kind of ministry was actually in the creative and the performing arts. I got the opportunity to go, I went to TCU in Fort Worth as a music major and then ended up double majoring in radio, TV, film, and theater. And then my wife and I actually met. I'm actually going to show you a little bit of my family here so you can see. My wife and I actually met in college. I was at TCU, she was at SMU. We met doing a show at the Dallas Theater Center called Guys and Dolls. And so that's where we met. We fell in love. And for whatever reason, now there's two artists living together, trying to figure out how we're going to make money and have a family. And so we got married and we ended up moving to LA, got involved in, film and commercial and all that kind of good stuff. Felt the calling of God to really utilize the creative gifts that we have in the church and made our way back to the Dallas area so I could potentially go to seminary. I didn't end up going to seminary because we got a call to go and work at a church in the area doing the creative direction for the church and children's and all the kind of stuff that they were doing. So we've been in this for a minute. We both still participate and engage in the creative arts. And in fact, my wife she still trains, and she actually had a movie earlier this year, Girl Who Believes in Miracles. She was in that movie, a TV show. Of course, I'm forgetting the name. All of a sudden, I was like, what is the name of that? Cruel Summer. She was in that this year. So we're kind of but as a family, we're kind of a creative family too, right? So my boys both play the piano, both are percussionists, both do theater and commercial work. We laugh. We actually, as a family, get to work together quite a bit. And we just finished this weekend. Actually, we were kind of running all around Texas shooting a Texas tourism commercial. So that was fun because we got to kind of see Texas together, and the boys made a little money, so they can buy their cars whenever they get to that point. And but we love it. Our family is a creative family, but you can also see that we are this interracial family as well. We've got interracial between white and black, my wife and I, and two biracial kids. And so this intersection of creativity and race kind of finds itself in the midst of our family and what we do. And one of the things that we talk about with our family is this understanding, this recognition that the way we create and what we create has power. And I think you guys probably recognize that too. Like, there are things that we do as musicians, as artists, as painters, as writers that have the opportunity to really transform the mindsets of people on lots of different issues and in lots of different arenas. And one of those spaces that we've seen that is in race. Now, we can always argue the question, right? Does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? That kind of deal. But I think we can argue that art has had quite a bit of impact on different things, particularly in the conversation around race. Here's a couple of examples of just some of the things we've seen. We can look up in the top left-hand corner of your screen, and we see that gentleman who's on his knees, sort of this minstrel show, right? This is an onstage show where white people would put on blackface to sort of emulate what their stereotypical versions of what Black people were like, right? And so that was where a lot of people found out or got their idea of what Black people were if they weren't in engagement with them. And they expressed that in that story and in ways that weren't productive. You also see in the top right hand, at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of stuff around Dr. Seuss and just going back and tracing sort of his racial motivations in the ways that he articulated his craft. And a lot of the way people sort of, particularly in his time, the way that people saw Asians were depicted visually by Dr. Seuss. And so he created that, and sort of some of the stereotypes that we have came through a lot of his writings growing up, particularly since there was a ban on sort of Chinese immigration in the times in which that Dr. Seuss was doing this. So we see that in the center, you recognize Tiger Lily and Peter Pan. Disney has done quite a bit to help the generation think about race, not always in positive ways. In fact, many of you, if you saw my bio, know that I have a podcast called Colored Commentary that I do pretty regularly. And actually in the very early shows, I think it's like episode 4, we did a whole issue on Disney and race. And so if you want to, you can go check that out. There's some fun things in there. We see in The Simpsons, we've got this Indian character that's there, and ways against people who aren't engaged with those who from Southeast Asia get a lot of their thoughts and things from just depicting that. And then down in the bottom right-hand corner, this was one of the most famous original feature films, The Birth of a Nation, in which we saw in the midst of this particular film the way that African Americans were imaged in ways that were very negative and very dangerous. And this film is responsible for reigniting the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. It was starting to die out. And when they saw this film, it just inspired that. So what we see is that art can inspire a lot of things in a lot of arenas, particularly in race. And that's not completely out of the question, even for Christians, right? So we look at just the ways that we create and do things, even in the Christian space, we see that we can determine a lot of things about how people think about race and how they think about themselves and how they think about God by the things we create. So you see this Jesus of Nazareth. This is one of the many films that have been created around Jesus where he is a white male. Now, we've been getting better about it. Like, we've been getting a lot better. That the show The Chosen is such a great show. It actually shot down here in Dallas where I am for a while. And my wife was trying to get on the show, but they were looking for mostly people of color. So and she wasn't able to get it. It was like a bizarro world for the theater, for the performance world, that white people weren't getting rooms, but colored people of color were. But that's wonderful that they're doing that in the midst of it. But we've seen other places, like in this movie, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus with these blue eyes, right? Storybooks about Jesus, right? He's a white male. You'll see in the bottom left, this is a production of the Passion Play, right? Or where they're talking about the birth of Jesus and Advent, and you see all the folks there are white, except for the one, in some ways, the key characters of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus tend to be white folks, and some others around can play other characters. And you see that nativity scene. And I say that because I bring a nativity scene because I actually, if you ever go and try to find a culturally correct nativity scene, it's very difficult to find. Most of them are going to have very pale-skinned folks. Some even go as far as blind-haired, blue-eyed folks. And if you do have a person of color, it's usually Balthazar, one of the Magi. And in most of those situations, he is one of the only people kneeling. The rest of the Magi are not, which is an interesting thing as well. So all that's to say that, just this connection with understanding that art and creative arts really can help transform the way people think about other people and different colors of folks as well. And it makes me think about several years ago, I got to go to the Vatican, and you can see here, this is a picture of a portion of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo, in which he, obviously paints his version of who God is on the right and who Adam is on the left. And you can see, again, you've got a lot of folks who you say, what does God look like? They'll say, I kind of mention this old white man with a beard. Well, a lot of that comes from pictures like this in the Sistine Chapel, right, where we have God who is this old man, and Adam is white and Eve is white. In fact, I remember going to Rwanda several years ago, and one of the questions that the Rwandans had to me is, how do we get Black and brown people when Adam and Eve were white? Right. So you can see, again, there's ways in which we can engage that from a creative art standpoint. And really, the way I even got started in the racial space came from an artistic expression in the Vatican. So I was in the Vatican. We're going to the Sistine Chapel. We're going through lots of different other rooms. They got rooms for everything, like jewelry. They got rooms for paintings, all those things. And I remember my wife and I, we turned the corner and got into this long hallway, and lining the hallway were some of the most beautifully intricate pictures that I had ever seen in my life. And I, of course, because we've been in so many other rooms with paintings, I thought these were paintings. And I remember we got in and started walking down this hallway, and I leaned in to look closer at these paintings. And what I saw was, I actually saw these small, colorful threads. And what I realized is that I wasn't looking at a painting, I was looking at a tapestry. And I remember stepping back from this tapestry, this big piece of fabric woven together by thread, and asking this question. I remember this as distinctly as anything. I remember in my mind going, who created this? right? Like, who is the artist that was able to create these beautiful renditions, right? These beautiful pictures of landscape and other things that are out there. Who created this? And I think in the midst of the conversation that I think about in the midst of what we do here at Threaded and what we do in the creative arts is I desire to see the church be a place that when the people on the outside see us, that they would be so inspired by our unity, even in the midst of our differentiations around our political backgrounds, our ethnic backgrounds. It was to be so motivated by that they would want to ask the question, who is the God who threaded these people together? And what I love is that it was this piece of art that inspired that. So I want to keep moving on. I'm having a little trouble maneuvering. This is part of the fun part of engaging in technology, of moving my what is this, the slideshow here. So I'm not sure if there's something going on as far as the technicalities are concerned. So I don't know if you guys can still hear me, if I'm still even in this thing, right? So I'm going to keep going in here, and you may just have to look at the version of Adam and
Marcus, we're hearing you fine, so I'm
Perfect.
not sure why the slides aren't moving for you.
Yeah,
so.
I don't know. Okay, good, but I'm glad you're hearing me. That helps me. You may have to just kind of engage with Adam and this version of God for a little while, and maybe it'll come back to us at some point. So as we start to think about, here we go. So good. I think good. So we're moving through. All right. One of the things I want to talk about is today, as we talk about getting creative about race, is I want to talk about what we can do from an action standpoint. And when I think about that, I love to tell stories in the midst of presentations because I think it just helps us. My wife and I got to go to the wine country way before my kids were born. And we got to go to this winery out in a place. And it was a winery that didn't just kind of serve wine and kind of tell you all those things, but it actually showed you how it paired wine with fruit. And so in the back, you would go out and they had all these areas, these orchards and these vineyards or whatever, where you can go out and you can actually pick the fruit right off the tree. And I'm a peach guy. Like, I love peaches. So in the summertime, I'm ready. Let's go peaches. And so we were there in the midst of like prime peach season. And I remember going up to these trees, and these peaches were monstrous. They were so lush. They were just, that whole idea when you talk about low-hanging fruit, that's what we were dealing with. And I remember taking a peach off the tree and biting into that peach, and it was perfectly ripe, and all the juices like exploded on my face and my mouth, right? And it was amazing. It was exactly how I wanted to eat a peach. And many of us have been there, right? Like, you guys have been there and had, maybe it's fruit or something else with you, but there's something about ripe fruit that's just so wonderful. But then the opposite is also true. Like, there's nothing worse than non-ripe fruit. Like, if you love peaches, like I love peaches, when you get to December and you're like, I want a peach, and you go to, your local grocery store and get a peach, man, it's terrible. You bite in that, it's soggy, right? You want to almost like spit it out of your mouth, right? You don't want to swallow it. You can't finish it. It's not fun to deal with something that is not ripe. And so as we talk about being creative in race, we're going to talk about this idea of being ripe for culturally creative action. And this RIPE is an acronym, right? And in the midst of it, we're going to be learning about, like, how do we create an environment where it's something people want to engage in over and over again? How do we do that so it's not something they want to spit out? And so this acronym works itself out like this. So you have R, which is reorient yourself, I, identify with others, P, plan action, and E, execute on that plan. We're going to start with reorient. What does it mean if you're wanting to be ripe for culturally creative action, what does it mean to reorient yourself? Well, because we have these navigation systems, right? We know exactly, like, hey, I'm here. And so you can pull up and go, this is where you are. Reorienting yourself in a cultural conversation tries to help you go, where am I in the midst of this conversation? So we want to take stock of where you are in your own cultural journey. And that happens in a couple of ways, right? What does it look like to reorient to your own cultural creativity? First is you've got to really start to evaluate and understand your desire, right? Like, what is it? Why do you want to do this? What is the intrinsic value that you see from being culturally creative, from either creating things in the midst of cultures or even learning about cultures to be creative? What's the intrinsic value? We talk about in Threaded this idea, if God created all of us in the image of God and it was a diverse image, then when we get engaged with other people from different cultures, we actually are getting more of God because we're experiencing more of his image. So that's an intrinsic benefit for me, that I get more of God as I expand my horizons to more culturally diverse engagements, either with people or with creativity. There's also an understanding your desire extrinsically, right? Like, what value do you see that the world, if you expand and you work culturally, creatively? For the church in the world, I think there's a value when we can image God together, when we can show engagements and interactions where we are working together. We better represent who God is truly, and so people get a better introduction to who God is. And so there's other ways that you can kind of see the value and benefit, right? Again, you get to learn more about different things, but for the world in and of itself, knowing and engaging with different cultures creatively, you get to experience more of the world and enjoy more of your time on the planet, but you get to exactly as well see more of who God is as well. So you've got to reorient yourself and take stock of your journey. You've got to understand your desire. Where are you? You've also got to understand your own culture. I think this is so important. Like, familiarize yourself with your own style. And where does this style come from? Does it have a cultural context? Is it coming from something in your own cultural history? How do you talk about your cultural art form, and how do you talk about other cultural art forms, right? I know that lots of times when people talk about music and they talk about classical music, which comes predominantly from a European cultural background, they label it as high art. And they label, let's say, jazz music, which comes out of some very gospel roots, definitely African-American roots in America. They would label that as low art, depending on the jazz, right? But low art. And just even the differentiation and stratification of what's more valuable and what's not can help us understand a little bit more about how we may see the art that we create and where we see other people's art as well. But understanding your own culture is a big deal. How has culture played a part in the art that you do, right? And the kind of art that you do? Are you doing things that represent your experiences and where you have come from? So you need to understand that, just again, to reorient yourself and find that. Understand the own extent of your cultural connections. Who do you hang out with? We in Threaded, we do sometimes when we train, we do these assessments to try to figure out and help people see like how homogenous or how diverse their world is, right? And so for you to evaluate that, asking questions, right? Who are my relationships, right? Like, who do I call or text and communicate with daily that aren't people that I'm employed by or who I employ? Where do I spend my time? Who do I spend my time with? Who are my friendships? And not just the friendships like, oh, I can go on Facebook and I can see that I've got all these friends that are different, but like actual spend time. We talk about in our house, like, who has refrigerator rights? You know what I mean? In your home. There are plenty of people, when they come in my home, they don't have to be told where anything is. They don't have to be told it's okay to go into the fridge and grab what they want. That's refrigerator rights. Who in your home, who has that refrigerator rights, and how diverse is that space? It'll help you start to orient yourself and to understand where you are and how your relationships work. Where do you get your information about the world? That's an important piece. If you're out there creating, you are again, whether it's art imitating life, you are coming out of a place that you have been poured into. And so what books are you reading? What movies are you watching? What TV shows are you watching, and how are they portraying different cultural backgrounds in the midst of it? Take stock of that, because if you don't have a lot of relational connection, a lot of times the ways people understand culture is through what they're experiencing through some sort of creative form, whether that's books or music or whatever. So that's the place too. And then where do you spend your time? Like, if you look around, like, it's places where it's going to be diverse or mostly homogenous. So as you reorient yourself in the midst of being right for culturally creative action, you have to think about these things, understand your desire, understand your own culture, understand your cultural connections. The next piece in our RIPE is to identify with others. I love this section of identifying with others. It's the place where we want to think about how do you creating relationships and an understanding of other groups and cultures. This is where I think about from a biblical standpoint, I think about this identifying with others. I think about Ruth and Naomi, where Naomi is trying to say to her daughters-in-laws, hey, you don't, my sons are dead. You don't have to come with me anymore. Go back to your own people. And Ruth says to her, where should we go? I'm going where you go. Your people are my people. Your God will be my God. So there's this place in which we want to get to the point where we can identify with each other and see who we are. So what does that look like to identify within your cultural creativity? First is you've got to build cultural knowledge. I talked about this idea of my wife and I, once we got married, we moved out to Los Angeles to get involved in the work there. Now that's a completely different environment, creative environment than we had been in. We had been in the Dallas environment. So part of what we had to do is we had to kind of start going where other creative artists went. We had to go to shows and start meeting people. We had to talk to others who knew where the hangouts were and start to go to those hangouts. We even joined a church that had a pretty intense creative group, an acting team there. And again, that's just trying to understand like where are the people and what are they like? What are the things they're creating? What's their lingo like, right? What are their, what's the language that they use to express themselves? What art forms are they predominantly working in? What are the cultural values and norms? So you do this in other places in your life. So again, when you're engaging culturally and you want to either create culturally or you want to engage other cultures so that you can create culturally, you want to learn more about that culture, right? Again, what's the values and norms that exist in that culture? We actually do a cultural intelligence training with Threaded where we kind of go through 10 different cultural values that are out there that 13 different cultural values that are out there, 10 ethnic groups or cultural groups. That's really been helpful for me as I've maneuvered into it. But being able to engage and see those things, learning about business systems, like how do business systems work in those places, right? And so building your own cultural knowledge is important to identifying with others. Second thing is you want to explore other cultural expressions, right? This is going to different theater shows and art shows and concerts and TV shows, watching different TV. I worked in, just recently I was working at a predominantly white church. And what I found is while I was maneuvering through that church, a lot of the other staff members were walking around quoting this show called Parks and Rec, which I had never seen. I'd heard of the show, but I'd never seen it. And so what I realized what I had to do is I had to go and I started binge watching Parks and Rec so that I could understand the jokes and the culture even better. I had to go into this predominantly white space of Parks and Rec to understand the culture, this predominantly white culture that I was in. And so that's something that is helpful if we're going to, again, be ripe for culturally creative action. We need to identify with others and do so by exploring other cultural expressions. We also want to build relationships with others, and that's a harder piece to do. And so to do it, what I want to do is actually use a movie that may help us understand what it looks like to identify with others. It's an older movie, but they're actually going to be making a new version of it, so I don't feel so bad aging myself with it. I would ask how many of you have seen Avatar, and you can absolutely answer via the chat if you want. But I cannot see the chat in my presentation mode. So I don't know how many of you have actually seen it. So I'm going to assume all of you have and none of you have. So I'm going to give you just a little synopsis. We've got this very science fiction movie that's out there where there is, it's, I don't know how many thousands of years, let's say, into the future, but somehow Earthlings have left Earth and they have been able to go to these other planets. And one planet that they have come to is this planet that's in Avatar. And for whatever reason, I've just forgotten the name of it, which I love the movie. I don't know how to do it, but Pandora, there it is. So go to Pandora. Now, Pandora has these native folks that live there. And on this planet, there is a resource that the Earthlings desire greatly to do the things they need to do. Now, the problem is the big piece of this resource exists underneath one of the settlements of one of the native peoples. And so they've got to figure out, how do I get in there and get this resource? And at first they were like, how do we do this without having to just destroy the tribe and just take it? And so they've created this scientific program where they built these avatars, these fake, almost humanoids, where a human can actually transition their consciousness into this, I know it's crazy, transition their consciousness into this humanoid version of the native people and drive it like a machine. But ultimately they become the machine. And so you have Jake Sully, and Jake Sully has been chosen to come and drive this avatar. Now, what's interesting is Jake is a twin. He had a brother who's a Marine, or he had a brother who's a scientist, and Jake is a Marine. His brother, the scientist, got killed, and the only person who could drive this avatar was somebody who had the very similar makeup of his brother. So they chose Jake to come and drive this avatar. So when Jake gets here, he immediately sees this avatar. You can see in the background. And one of the things that Jake says when he sees it is he goes, "Oh man, it looks like him." And so in some of the ways to identify with others, you have to see yourself in others. What do you see in others that's common? Well, we got an ear, we got ears and nose and mouth, right? Those kinds of things. See yourself in others. And there's other things maybe in how you think about life that you can see. And so there's lots of different things. How are we connected? What do we have in common? Try to see yourself in the pain and empathy and joys. The second thing is you enter into their world. What Jake Sully does is they're trying to go and engage the natives on Pandora through these avatars. And so Jake has got to go in and be a part of the world. So what he does is he actually enters into a body that represents this native people. And so he enters their world and he's in this body. He's like, oh my gosh, I know what it's like now. The hands feel different. The feet are bigger. The athletic prowess is different, right? And so he immerses himself in the very being of this people and the culture. So for us, it's the same thing. How do you enter into the world of those who are different than you? Immerse yourself in their culture, go to lunch with them, invite neighbors over for dinner. We talked about refrigerator, right? To get them into that spot. Even ask somebody how they're doing and engaging, particularly with things that are going on right now. How are they engaging in the midst of some of this environment? So we want to see ourselves and others to identify with others and enter into their world. The next is link your life with them. So Jake Sully comes and he actually gets in there and he becomes a part of the tribe and he links himself to the tribe, right? Your people are my people. It becomes that deep with him. And so the way we do that with others, how do we link ourselves with others, right? We talk about racial issues because that's a big piece, particularly if you're a person of color. These race issues are every day, all the time. I can't even tell you, like 24/7, you're thinking about it. So talking about that is important. And I put in here not right away because you want to give a little bit for your relationship to build, right? Vacation together, right? I'm actually going on a trip, leaving out here, going on a trip in a little bit with some folks who are from different cultural backgrounds as well. Watch movies together. Part of my team, we watch these movies, these classical movies from Asian backgrounds, Latino backgrounds, Black backgrounds, white backgrounds to kind of know more other, link our lives, serve in the community together, spend holidays together, own up to the mistakes that you make with one another and mourn and celebrate together. So we see ourselves, enter in the world and link. Marry them. I put that at the end because that's what I did I linked my life literally with a woman who's different than me. Learn from them. So many times Jake comes in and he doesn't allow himself just to kind of be in there, but he says, hey, teach me your ways. So we want to learn from each other and put ourselves in positions where we are under the authority of another person's leadership, particularly somebody who may have a different cultural background. It puts you in a position of submission and humility so that you can learn. So ask them to teach you about your culture. Ask them what they should be reading to understand things better. How you'll be discipled by them. It's really fascinating stuff. So see yourself and others, enter into their world, link your lives with them, learn. And then the last one is to stand with them in trouble. In the movie, the Earthlings decide that they're just going to take this resource and kind of wipe out the tribe. They just got impatient. But Jake had gotten so dug in and so connected to the tribe, he decides that he is going to fight with them against his own people. So he stands with them in the midst of injustice and trouble, right? Affirm the injustice in the community. Use your power and privilege to do something about their injustice and fight for their rights. These are things that we can do to stand with others in trouble. And don't let others say false things about other folks. This is where being courageous and stopping people from just throwing out brazen stereotypes would be so helpful to stand with others in the midst of this. I'm gonna keep moving. Because one of the things you have to be careful of as you're starting to identify with each other is you don't want to have a savior complex. In this movie, one of the things that's not great is that ultimately what's happening is this earthling, which represents really the white society as opposed to the brown society. He comes in and they can't actually win the battle without him leading, and he becomes the savior. So it's not a great way to think about that, but so I wanted to caution if you're going to watch the movie to know that that's a place that we have to be careful when we're identifying with each other and coming in and saying, hey, let's work together culturally, that sometimes it can have a savior complex. So we have reorient, identify with others, plan action is the next one. And we'll get through this pretty quick. To plan systemic action, this is a cultural creative action. Determine where you want to go and what you want to do with others. So this is once you reorient yourself, you identify with others, you start to go, okay, so where am I trying to actually head? And so you start to plan together. How do you do that? You practice diverse leadership, right? Planning, instead of planning on your own and saying, hey, we're going to go and do this thing. We're going to do a gospel choir and we're not going to talk to anybody who's Black to do it, right? Like no, diverse leadership allows you to plan. And what you may find in that diverse leadership of going out, whether you're going to do something creatively together, is that you will come up with something completely different that doesn't necessarily fully represent one particular group, cultural group, but is a better representation of all the groups, right? So you work with a diverse crew on creation. You allow people to think about who has the power in that situation, allow people to have the final word that's not you. Make sure these are major stakeholders, right? As you're doing that, you've got to be sensitive, right? This is a difficult area we're in. Everybody's kind of just walking on eggshells. You want to be sensitive. There may be some reaction in the midst of it. So you want to listen closely to what people are saying and what they're not saying. Remember the cultural knowledge that you gathered early on in the process of trying to understand, well, why is this happening? Okay, so why is this person communicating like this? Well, they may come from a culture that's indirect and your culture is direct. And so you have to understand that. That helps you. Make sure you're hearing from everyone. It can be very easy to kind of hear from the people that you trust or that you're closest to culturally, but you want to open up the door for everybody because you'll be surprised what might happen. Make it an attempt to speak the language in a sense. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be the actual language, but maybe the lingo in some ways. Understand it, right? Like if I would do these trainings sometimes when I was at my white church, when we go partner with Black churches, I'd say, when you go in there, make sure you're not calling people by their first name. You either call them by their title, right? If they're a pastor, you go pastor such and such, or you call them Mr. or Mrs. so-and-so, right? Like that's the lingo of a Black church. So that's what you have to go. So you want to be sensitive and try to speak the lingo. And then as you're working and planning, you always want to check in. How are we doing? Is everybody feeling heard? Are all perspectives being brought to the table, right? So you want to check in with members. And then take a step back, right? And you step back and see how much of your culture is represented in the product, in the process that you're making, right? That's an important piece of planning. The last piece of ours, we've got reorient.
Marcus,
Yes.
let me interrupt you. You're doing so great. So I don't want you to feel like you rush. Every one of the questions I'm getting, you are addressing them already. So don't feel like you've got to rush. If you finish, maybe I'll, address a couple of questions, but feel free to go the whole time. So
okay, cool. Well, I'm getting close to the end. We're getting it, but as we talk about the reorient, the identify, and the plan, the last piece is actually executing. And so this is actually pretty simple when we get to this. It is just do it. Like actually make it happen, right? So what does it look like to execute within your cultural creativity? Is first, you've got to do what you plan. I can't tell you how many stories I've had and even experience I've had where people are trying to work cross-culturally, whether it's a creative engagement or something in missions or in ministry or engagement in the community. And we sit and we plan and we get it, but somehow at the end it stops or it gets stalled. Sometimes what happens is those who are in the process of planning don't have the power to actually move the people that they represent. And so they may be working on it away from the power structure. And then once they're ready to go to their people, let's just call it an example. If I'm in a church and I'm a minister at a church and I've been working with a cross-cultural committee of other church leaders in the community, and we're wanting to do something in the community together, I'm working on it. I'm ready to now take it back to my church and get the people in my church to get engaged. But the senior pastor or the elders or whoever the governing board hasn't been a part of the conversation. And then when they see it, they say, no, we're not doing that because we don't work with them, or we don't feel comfortable, or it's not the right time, or whatever. And then all of a sudden, all this goodwill that you've been creating cross-culturally kind of gets thrown out the window because particularly, it gets thrown out because people say, oh, see, you didn't want to actually work with us in the beginning and you wasted their time by doing it. So it's important that even before you get started on really getting into the plan, is that you get the blessing of the people you need to get the blessing to, so that if you do create or plan something, that you will be able to execute on it, because it's important, because we've seen lots of things not executed. So you work the plan, do what you plan, go out and do it. And then you evaluate, right? Just like anything else that you do, right? If you're creating an event of some sort, even some of us, if we work in churches on Sundays, you evaluate, how did we do in that? And if you're creating something, most of what I'm talking about today is how do you create it in relationship with people, right? Instead of just thinking about, oh, I'm going to go off and paint a picture by myself. It may be, how do I paint this with either a cultural lens that I'm looking through, or at least have some cultural representation that can look at it and go, hey, am I expressing the fullness of what your culture or what the culture looks like through your lens and your eyes, right? But either way, you want to evaluate the work that you're doing so that you can do more of it, right? So you evaluate it. Sometimes it's going back to the planning process and started checking in and going, okay, what did we miss? How can we do this better? A lot of times we use the terminology, I wonder. Okay. So if you're working with cross-culturally, you're having to debrief. Sometimes it's hard to kind of go, well, I didn't like this. So utilizing the terms I like and I wonder are helpful. I really like this about what we did. And the I wonder is where you put the critique. I wonder if it would be okay if we don't use so much guitar next time, or if we don't use the organ, or maybe it's less, or whatever it is. It's an I wonder. And so it creates this space of which doesn't feel quite like a critique. And like I said, this space is a sensitive space. So we want to be cognizant of that and really go in there, is bring as much humility as possible. So you do what you plan, you evaluate, and then you do it again. Right. This work of being culturally creative and doing a culturally creative actions, either with others or even on your own, it doesn't happen and you don't get great at it overnight. Like, you got to keep working on it and keep doing it. We have spent hundreds of years creating barriers to cross-cultural engagement. Hundreds of years. And those aren't just physical barriers. They are political barriers. They are emotional barriers. They are wounds that have created barriers. There are all kinds of barriers we created. And so to now start to, as some of those barriers are coming down, to try to now create together, like it just takes a little time. You're not going to get it right. But what I love is that what we know is that it can be done, right? We talk about I always talk about Revelation 7:9. And what we see in the end there is we get this vision from the Apostle John, where he's given this vision from God, and he says, behold, I looked, and there's a great multitude that no one can number, from all tribes and tongues and nations, in the throne room of God, wearing white robes, waving palm branches in their hands, and shouting out in a single loud voice, salvation belongs to our God and the Lamb. This is a great picture of this diverse body of Christ in the throne room of God. Who knows what they're doing? I'd like to imagine that they're singing and praising God with lyre and harp and a a bass guitar and any other stuff that you can think of in there that would be appropriate culturally. But we're having a good time in there, and we see that this has already happened, right? Like, as we work and execute on the plan, we keep working it because we know that we will eventually be successful eternally in this, because we have gotten a vision of it. So that what that means is, as we move toward emulating that vision to the world of what it looks like in Revelation 7:9, that we have the power of God, the spiritual power of God, moving us forward and giving us all we need to be good at this. So as you work the plan, you will make mistakes, evaluate those, and get out and do it again, knowing that you have the power of God behind you to make those things happen. And as you do that, you will start to recognize that you can truly become ripe for creative cultural action by reorienting yourself, identifying with others, planning action, and executing on that plan. So thank you very much. That's the time I have. I would love to see what questions I did not get to, and then we can have some fun with that.
Well, great. Well, I mean, the comments have been just unbelievable. We've got cross-cultural people on here that do training, and they say what you just did is cross-cultural ministry 101, whether you're going around the world or in your community. So exactly. It's just, it is great. One question we had here, you kind of talked a little bit about at the beginning, but maybe a little of your own journey. Kind of how did you get to where you are today? Were there some key, times or experiences that got you to a place that enabling you to minister in the way you are in this space?
Yeah, well, I grew up as an African-American male in a predominantly white society. My parents were very poor growing up, and so money became sort of a space that it didn't become an idol, but it was definitely something that they wanted. And so my dad worked really hard. Both are mathematicians, chemists, My dad's an engineer. My mom actually tried to be an engineer, but was pushed out because she was a woman in black in her college. But we ended up in the suburbs where the great schools were, and ended up around a lot of white folks. And so I developed a lot of relationships in white environments. And so I had to really survive in that space. And so I learned about how to engage cross-culturally to survive, and make great relationships and great friendships in the midst of that. A lot of that stuff has been interesting in the last couple of years to see whether those relationships are still viable based on the things that I teach and engage, because I do deal with a lot of race conversations and not everybody's comfortable in that. But I grew up in that space and doing creative space, doing art as well. Like even getting into theater, the thing that got me into theater was actually the color of my skin. I'm known as a football player, singer, all that good stuff. But when I got into high school, I was playing football and I actually broke my arm the third to last game. And so I couldn't go on and play baseball. And so I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I was in the choir in my high school, and our theater was doing a show called Showboat, which most of you are probably familiar with, one of the oldest musicals out there. And if you're familiar with, it needs a lot of black people. And I just told you I'm in a predominantly white environment. I mean, it's so white that the only two people that could go and audition for, I always get Joe and Jim from Big River mixed up. I want to go with Jim. No, Joe, I think is who it is. The only two people auditioning for that was myself and my older brother. I had the theater guy come to me and say, "Hey, we need you to audition for this role, and you're going to sing Old Man River." And I ended up, I always like to say this because my brother is like super genius, right? I ended up beating him out of this and got the role, and was singing Old Man River as a 14-year-old going through puberty. So which is like Old Man River. And it was like no mics or anything. It was crazy. So anyway, that's how I got in, is because I fit the bill of who they needed. I fit the bill of a slave. That's what they needed. So but through my work of getting into theater, I kept moving through that and found myself doing roles that represented Black people, but also one of my mentors in college was really helping me work and to be able to where I can cross over different roles and do different things. So, working into sort of that non-regional accents, right? The styles, being able to maneuver between styles. And that's just, from a racial standpoint, I just found myself going back and forth, and then meeting my wife, who's white, really kind of locked me in on that as well. Yeah. So that's a little bit.
Great. Another question, kind of, I'm taking this and manipulating it just a little bit, but asking about, addressing, how do we encourage or address individuals who are the minority and encouraging them to be able to share, making it a safe space for them? Are there ways maybe engaging in a conversation or suggestions on, us, in enabling and helping individuals to share?
Yeah, it depends on the space, obviously, but I think the more you allow them to participate in the creation of the space, the safer they feel. I mean, we all feel better once we're able to be a part of creating the actual space we're in, because we can now know what may happen in that space. It's a hard road, right? Particularly right now, it's a really difficult building one-on-one relationships. I mean, sometimes we ask minorities to kind of come up and get on stage or do different things before they've had a chance to build one-on-one relationships with the people that are with them or leading. So creating a space where folks can get to know one another, they can have good conversations. It's part of what we do in Threaded is we build these groups. We're actually doing facilitator training in this building right now, where we're building groups where people can have these conversations. So people engaging with me a lot of times, I think in the midst of really difficult things, like when you see the stuff that happened that went on last year, kind of bringing me to the side and going, "Hey man, how are you doing with all of that?" What that did with me is it opened up this space of like, oh, you care, like you recognize that this may be hitting me differently than it's hitting you, and that you care to understand it. And then just listening, not being there to sort of comment or to correct in a sense, but just to listen. I love my team of Threaded. I've got white, Black, Hispanic, Southeast Asian, like everything. But one of the key core members is a white guy, and we don't agree on everything. But one of the things he did well with me is, when I was in the midst of some of the frustration, I just needed to get that stuff out. He didn't agree with everything I was talking about, but he didn't bring that up until much later. He allowed me to kind of work and listen. So listening to folk is a very big piece, and inviting them to create that environment with you.
Sure. And a follow-up to that, I mean, it's just so hard to have conversation these days because it immediately disintegrates into I'm right, you're wrong, argument. Any suggestions on dispelling maybe anger or whatever to even open up that opportunity to have an engagement?
Well, again, I think, yeah, kind of like what I was saying, I think relational equity really opens that up. Being able to do things with people, have history with them. I think walking up to anybody and having a conversation about race is just always a difficult conversation if you don't know them, because everybody's scared, right? Everybody's fearful. They're either, if you're on the side that I'm on, you're fearful that you're going to be, turned into some sort of object of critique, right, in which are stereotyped, or some kind of microaggression that may happen in the midst of it. And if you're only like my wife's side, right, she's worried about being always looked at as the villain, right, and there's no win in the midst of it, right? So you have to understand what you're going into. And I think if everybody comes into it with this we talk about it in Threaded, like comes in with if everybody comes with a kingdom mindset, that this is not about making myself look good. This is not about building my own brand or anything, but it's actually about how do I engage this in such a way that God's kingdom will be made great and that his name will be made known in the midst of this conversation. That's helpful. And then to go in there with the confessional posture, like we talk about confessional conversations, that we're all willing to say, you know what, I don't know everything in this conversation. Like I have plenty that I probably have blind spots about, some unknown areas, those of you who are familiar with the Johari window, some unknown areas, some blind spots. And so I need to own that. So one of the things we talk about in Threaded all the time is it's kind of yes and. So somebody would say, hey, Markus, you know what, you really are reacting in ways that are defensive. Yes, and I do this a lot. I'm actually pretty bad at this. I need to get better. I need help, right? So I just own a little bit of more of that stuff. So confessional. Now, in the midst of that, what's helpful is that there's a grace extending on the other side of it. And that's where I know in this conversation, a lot of times I have to be the one to be bringing grace, extending that to my white brothers and sisters to go, look, just keep talking. It's okay. I'm not going to jump down your throat every time you say something that's not supposed to be said to me. I'm just going to keep loving you because that's what Jesus has taught me to do. And then, I'm going to contend courageously for those who are having issue. So, and I'm going to contend for your thought process. So if you come to me and you're talking about something, I want to contend for you to have that thought process. Even if I don't agree with it, I want to contend for you to have it so that we can be able to talk more about that. So those are a couple of things. Again, think kingdom in the midst of the conversation, position yourself there, be confessional, admit that you're coming with issues, get the log out of your own eye, right? And then, offer grace in the midst of the conversation, and then work to contend so everybody's voice can be heard in the midst of your conversation.